Hello, I'm Four Corners of the Page. I'm really glad you're here. And first of all, forgive the even worse production quality than normal. The light above me has just killed itself. But you know what? A somewhat gloomy and dark aesthetic might be quite appropriate because today I want to talk about Stephen King. I find that with Stephen King, it never rains but it pours. Because I mentioned in my February TBR that I do want to be reading Fairy Tale by Stephen King, and in fact I'm about halfway through it, and I'm really enjoying it. But I can never just read one Stephen King book. I find I read a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth. He's very audiobookable as well, so I might even continue on after that. And I figure if this is something that I've begun to start doing, which I think is beginning to slide into reading several Stephen King books back to back, I should be talking about it on here because Stephen King is really one of my favourite authors. I love this man to pieces. And I know that I'm not alone in that. I know this is by no means an original opinion. But hey, it's my channel, and I want to gush about him. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend the next maybe couple of weeks making 3 or 4 videos on Stephen King. I think this first one is going to be called something along the lines of why do I love Stephen King, kind of like my Wandering In video. It might be misconceptions about Stephen King. They kind of do blend together because I think although he's very famous, people who haven't read him don't quite understand what he is about on the page. So I do want to talk about that. I'm going to follow that up with maybe where you should start with Stephen King, 5 books that I would recommend as a good beginner. And then I also want to do some kind of ranking of all the books I've read of his, because I have read, I think, 63. I counted yesterday when I should have been working. I counted about 63. So I think that's enough that I can maybe put them in a line, like I've done with Malaz and like I've done with Dungeon Crawler Carl, and talk about them. And the ones that I think are good, the ones that I think are excellent, and the 3 or 4. And it is only really 3 or 4 that I think are just not worth your time whatsoever. Yeah, if anyone is up for a Stephen King discussion, wants to talk about King, a certain book in detail, or just a general conversation, I would absolutely welcome that. With Anna from Russia with Books, I can't remember if we did this off or on camera, but we had a 10 or 15 minute discussion about our love of Stephen King and what he does that people don't really talk about with him, or at least people kind of mainstream don't really talk about, because people just view him as a horror writer, don't they? And in fact, let me begin now by talking about why I love Stephen King, because this actually comes into my first point, which is that he is not a horror writer. And I will die on this hill. And I think Stephen King himself would disagree with me, but well, I don't care, I'm still right. He's not a horror writer. He is a character writer with horror elements as a major component of his works. Stephen King's best books, with a couple of exceptions, It is the one I can think of, do not really survive or die upon how good the horror element is. Some of his books are frankly pretty silly. A car that eats people, okay. There's this killer frogs in one of his short stories, things like that. The thing that you get in a Stephen King book that is really the most important quality of the whole thing is the characters, and whether you enjoy the characters or not. And I don't think I've ever come across a character, well, that's probably not true, but there's very few authors I've come across who can make a likable character even when they're flawed, as well as King can. And that's really what the crux of Stephen King is. He is a very soft-hearted man, I would imagine, or at least he is in his writing. It's all about whether you love these characters. The Dark Tower, The Stand, 11/22/63. Fairy Tale, I would say, is just like this. He creates these people who are often deeply flawed, but still often trying their best. I think most Stephen characters, their defining characteristic is not that they're writers from Maine, but they are really trying hard in the situation that they're in, with the demons that they are fighting. And often as well with Stephen King, the monsters aren't actually anything to do with the cars that munch people. It's to do with often alcohol addiction is a big part of King's work, or addiction in general. And you can argue that The Dark Tower, his magnum opus, is also about addiction. I think that's very clear. And when the horror element is at its best, it's got nothing to do with the fact that it's a stupid car that's going to eat you. It's the fact that you have built up such a care for these characters over several hundred pages, even a couple of thousand pages, and you are so scared they're going to be taken away from you. And he often does take them away from you. King is not a horror writer. That is not his thing. Well, it is his thing. It's what he's famous for. But really, when you read his book, that is not why you stick around. And it's not why you pick up the next one. It's because you've latched onto these individuals so deeply and you are so scared of letting them go. And that is, kind of ironically, so addictive. All right, I love that for him. This kind of blends into my second point about Stephen King, which is that I don't think he's nearly as predictable as people say he is. He definitely has a template. And I made a joke just now about the writer from Maine. A lot of Stephen King's books have very, very similar beginnings, to the point that it's almost hilarious. Again, the writer from Maine, the writer from upstate New York, the writer from New England, who often moves to a small town of some variety and usually meets, a pretty lady about his age. And that is true. That's a lot of Stephen King's books. Not all of them, but it could definitely be called a trope of his, or part of his formula. But I don't think that predictability is entirely warranted for King. Because while he has that beginning, it's not where he finishes up. And again, if you're a Stephen King fan, you'll know this. No one really knows, including Stephen King, how he is going to end his stories. And that becomes a double-edged sword. It means that often his endings are a bit deflating because he hasn't planned them out. There's very rarely a twist in Stephen King's books, something that has had to be set up with the plot. But what it does mean, no matter what, if you agree with the ending or you think it's rubbish, it means that you're in for a wild ride. Because it's very clear that King is making things up as he goes along. Maybe he has a kind of outline in his mind before he wants to go, but he will be happily and gleefully and spectacularly just wander off if he feels like that's where the story is going. It's almost for King like the story is a living, breathing entity, and he will take it where the pages beforehand dictate that he needs to take it. So I don't think he's predictable in the way that he builds a climax and conclusion to his stories. Again, that's not to say they're all brilliant. I know, for example, The Stand, people sometimes argue or disagree about the ending. I quite like it. The Dark Tower, people disagree about that ending. I quite like it. But what you can never say about Stephen King is you know exactly where it's going to go. And that's another reason that I really do adore his work. And it's one reason I'm quite excited for the ending of Fairy Tale, actually. People say that the second half is not nearly as good as the first half, which may well be true, but I don't know where it's going to go. And I'm really excited about that. But I'll save that for my review. The third thing I'll say about King, and a real reason that you might want to consider giving him a go, especially if you're a new reader. I recently subscribed to a channel. I'm blanking on the name, do forgive me. I'll leave it in the description down below. First Chapter, I think. Hello, First Chapter, if you're watching. This is a channel who has just come from nowhere and decided to start reading this year, full stop, and has never read books properly in adulthood and wants to begin that. And I would say to you, mate, if you're listening, and to anyone who's not really has found this video but not really done much of Stephen King is an excellent place to start. That's not to say he's simple. That's not to say that he's kind of easy all the time, but he is extremely readable. I don't think you'll find a book that can grab you as Stephen King can, page for page. He's also really good for audiobooks for that reason. His prose just, you can slam through 20 pages of Stephen King without realizing what you're doing. And I think also on a technical level, while his prose is never going to leave you kind of cognitively overstimulated and make you kind of need to take a long rest after. Usually it's quite flowing, his prose, which is lovely. But I think that works really well because what he is the storyteller, and this is quite similar to what I mentioned about Pirate Abba in my Wandering In review, which I'll also kind of link down below. He just knows how to tell a story, and it's such a joy to read Stephen King and to watch him. I think a quote of his own is to just put these words in a line. But that's not to say that there's nothing technically interesting about Stephen King. And I was talking about this again with Anna from Russia with Books, is that one of my favourite techniques that Stephen King does, I can't even call it foreshadowing, because he just tells you what's going to happen in a way that is actually really rewarding. You have character X and character Y sitting on a bench having a conversation, and then Stephen King will say something along the lines of, and that was the last time they ever saw each other. And you just feel the stomach drop out from under you in a way that is really actually rewarding and plays with your mind and messes with you in a really masterful way. King is kind of the best person for this. And there's a certain line in Pet Sematary, and if you've read it, you know the exact one I'm thinking of, where it crushes you when he tells you what's going to happen in the future. Not in a way that seems like a spoiler, but just in a way that, again, just messes with you. And it's so brilliant when he does it, but it's so horrible because, again, going back to point one, you do love these characters so much. Moving on to I believe this is point 4, forgive me if I'm wrong. Another reason that I love Stephen King is that he's a bridge between the old and the new. I believe Carrie was published, about the same time as Star Wars, the first Star Wars, I think like 1970 something, 74. And since then, Stephen King has published about 70 books. And this has put him in a really interesting spot in the modern fantasy, horror, speculative, whatever you want to call it, canon. Because he's new enough, he's still publishing works, he's still very much involved in the space, and also concurrently, his works are mature enough that they kind of have begun to be riffed on by other people. They're almost like a bridge between something like Dracula. He has, Salem's Lot, and then you have people kind of taking the idea of Salem's Lot, his vampire novel, and carrying that forward. Same thing with, I would argue, what could you argue about? The Stand, this apocalyptic work. People have now taken this idea of the apocalypse, which Stephen King didn't, back to the Book of Revelation, but have taken his particular spin on The Stand and started to produce their own kind of similar books. He is this amazing middle ground that I think he needs to be appreciated more for. And that's kind of all I have to say about that, but he is historically, within the fantasy kind of canon, if you want to call it that, this really centerpiece that is a bridge between the old and the new, which makes him a very interesting read, whether you've read no fantasy whatsoever or you've just never touched upon Stephen King. And the last one I'll say, and I say this with such fondness, he is the OG shared universe. We talk a lot about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and all the stuff that intertwines. And we can talk about Brandon Sanderson and the fact that all of his stories intertwine. But really, I've not read anyone who's done it as well as Stephen King. Am I going to make that that assertion? Yeah, I am. Now, again, Stephen King is not a planner. He has no great end goal, I think. But there's something really rewarding about Stephen King because all of his books fit together. If you're not aware, you have this magnum opus of his called The Dark Tower, which has the best elevator pitch ever, which is that a cowboy knight is travelling through post-apocalyptic worlds to reach the centre of the universe is. And that's all I'll say about that. But every single book set in a Stephen King world in some way connect, either explicitly or just by dint of being part of his bibliography, connected to The Dark Tower. And you can find all these spreadsheets online and all these flowcharts online that show just how intricate everything is, where characters from here will pop up from here. People will reference different characters and events in Stephen King's other novels, things like that. And you've also got this really interesting metafictional element to it. I don't want to get into this too much because it does spoil some books, but you'll have characters referenced, for example, in fairy tale, someone referenced, oh, that's like that movie Cujo, which again will sound a bit strange, but if you've read Stephen King, you'll know that that actually does kind of work quite well. And so if you're looking for Stephen King, he is both a really easy one-off writer. He's a really good writer to pick up on a holiday and just see if he's someone you're into. And you're never far from a Stephen King book, digitally or paperback, which is a really good thing about him. But if you're willing to invest that time, and you're willing to invest that reading page by page, what's the word I'm looking for? Just investment. If you're looking to invest that investment, forgive me, into Stephen King, he is a very rewarding author because he paints this picture that in each book that is actually part of a much larger tapestry and becomes this thing that, like me, will rant and rave about to people. So many people see Stephen King in a bookshop and they see the Stephen King section and they just see him as pulpy and they just see him as, whatever, kind of next to all these other big authors that probably aren't worth your time just because there's so much of it. And I would just fundamentally disagree with that. So if you haven't read any Stephen King, this is your wake-up call. And please watch the next video that I'll probably try and post in the next few days about where I recommend you start with Stephen King. And if, like me, you are a huge Stephen King fan, please jump in the comments. Let me know your favourite book. Let me know which one you think are good. If you're not a fan of Stephen King, let me know about that as well. I just think he's so worth the discussion. And his name has become such a symbol of fantasy. We can forget that there's actually a really good writer behind that symbol. For a lot of people. So this is your wake-up call if you haven't read him already. Please read him and please look out for the next video when I go a bit further into detail about specific works of his. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you on the next one.